An honor transcript is a detailed record of academic and extracurricular achievements. But today, we're looking at a different kind of record. One written not in ink, but in the silence between heartbeats. Not of achievements, but of dissents. This is the transcript of a mind unraveling, a truth clawing its way out of the dark. And it begins, as these things so often do, with a child. The rain doesn't fall in coastal Oregon, it breathes. A fine, persistent mist that clings to the Douglas firs and settles on the window panes of my office like a spectral touch. For years, this office was my sanctuary, a place of quiet data, of observable patterns, of children's drawings that could be decoded with a textbook and a gentle question. I am Dr. Alaina Reed. My life's work is finding the logic in a child's chaos. But a new kind of chaos had begun to find me. It started with a number, a statistical ghost. In a longitudinal study on early childhood development, I was analyzing birth data against behavioral markers. It was tedious, methodical work, the kind that lulls you into a sense of order. Then I saw it, a cluster, small but statistically significant. Children born between 1200 a.m. and 12:05 a.m. They scored anomalously high on one metric, unprompted social responses. In layman's terms, they were smiling, laughing, and sometimes reacting with fear to things that weren't there. My first thought was a flaw in the data, a reporting error from a specific hospital. I cross-referenced. The pattern held: Portland, Eugene, Salem. A dozen different hospitals, all reporting the same whisper of an anomaly. Mothers would note it in their daily logs. Liam laughed for 10 minutes at the empty ceiling today. Or, Chloe seems fascinated by the corner of her room. She stares at it for hours. One note, scribbled in the margin of a questionnaire, sent a cold spider walk down my spine. It's like he sees someone standing behind me. He won't look at me, only at the space just over my shoulder. I brought it up once, in a staff meeting. The air grew thick with polite skepticism. Dr. Peterson, my senior colleague, a man whose worldview was hermetically sealed against anything that couldn't be measured in a beaker, cleared his throat. "Alaina," he'd said, his voice laced with a gentle condescension, "you're talking about confirmation bias. A new parent is sleep-deprived, anxious. A shadow becomes a ghost. A draft becomes a whisper." He suggested I take some time off. He said my work-life balance was suffering. He was right about one thing. My balance was off. A year prior, I had given birth to my daughter, Ellie. Her time of birth, etched onto the hospital bracelet I kept in a small silver box, was 12:01 a.m. At the time, it felt special. A new life for a new day. Now, marker, a designation. I would go into her nursery at night, the air smelling of lavender and warm milk, and I would watch her sleep. I'd tell myself Peterson was right. It was just data, coincidence, the product of tired minds seeing patterns in the static. But then, one night, the static began to take shape. Ellie was 6 months old, just learning the magic of pointing. Her small, chubby finger, a thing of impossible perfection, would lift and aim, not at her mobile of soft, felt stars, not at the family photos on her wall, not at me. She would point, with unwavering certainty, at the empty corner of the ceiling where the two walls met the roof. She would lie there in her crib, a tiny, helpless thing in a world I was supposed to make safe, and stare into that blank space. Her gaze was not vacant. It was focused, intent. And one evening, as I stood by her crib, my heart a cold stone in my chest, she turned her wide, blue eyes to me, then back to the corner. And from her lips came the first true fracture in my world. Not a word, but a sound shaped into one. A gurgle of infant discovery. "Da," she'd said, pointing. Then again, more clearly, a perfect, chilling mimicry of a phrase she could have never been taught. "Down, lookin' down," and she smiled. Not at me, but at whatever she saw up there, in the empty, shadowed corner of the room, looking down at us both. A child's first words are meant to be a celebration. Mama, Dada, a treasured recording in the digital scrapbook of their life. Ellie's first coherent phrase became a secret I kept locked away, a piece of evidence I refused to analyze. I told myself she was mimicking something she'd heard on television, a fragment of overheard conversation. The human brain, especially a developing one, is a master of mimicry. I clung to that clinical explanation like a prayer. It was a shield against the icy dread that seeped into our home, as subtle and pervasive as the Oregon mist. Life continued. Ellie grew. She learned to walk, her unsteady steps a joyful drumbeat on the hardwood floors. She learned to laugh, a sound that should have filled the house with light. But her development was bifurcated. There was the Ellie who engaged with me, who played with her wooden blocks and loved the story of the runaway bunny. And then there was the other Ellie, the one who would stop mid-play, her head cocked as if listening to a distant conversation, the one who would wander to the hallway and hold entire babbling conversations with the empty air. Her pointing didn't stop. It became more specific. She no longer pointed at the ceiling. Now, she would point to the chair in the living room where my late husband, Mark, used to sit. Or she'd stand at the bottom of the stairs, her gaze fixed on the top landing, and wave. A tiny, cheerful wave to nothing. I tried to engage it directly once. "Ellie, sweetie, who are you waving to?" I asked, my voice a strained performance of maternal curiosity. She looked at me, her expression not secretive, but confused, as if the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. "Him," she said simply, and turned back to wave again. The rationalizations became more elaborate. She has a vibrant imagination. She's processing her environment in a unique way. She's gifted. I repeated these phrases to myself, to my mother on the phone, to the pediatrician who noted her advanced verbal skills. They were hollow affirmations, thin walls against a rising tide. The true test, the moment my carefully constructed denial began to crumble, came on her second birthday. Among her presents was a large easel and a set of chunky, brightly colored crayons. I had imagined her drawing suns and flowers, the messy, joyful scribbles of a toddler. Her first drawing was of me, a crude stick figure with wild, dark hair and a smiling red mouth. My heart swelled. This was normal. This was what I had been waiting for. I taped it to the refrigerator, a trophy of normalcy. But the next day, another drawing appeared. It was our house, a simple box with a triangle roof, and next to it, a tall, thin figure. It was rendered entirely in white crayon, the wax pressed so hard against the black construction paper that it flaked onto the floor. It had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, blank oval for a head. It was standing beside a bed, and in the bed was another figure, a smaller, scribbled version of me, asleep. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Ellie, honey, who is this?" I asked, pointing to the faceless form. My voice was trembling. Ellie walked over, crayon in hand, and tapped the white figure. "The quiet man," she said, matter-of-factly. "He watches you sleep." She said it with the same casual innocence she used to announce she was hungry. There was no fear in her voice, no sense of anything being wrong. She picked up a blue crayon and began drawing rain over the house. I stood frozen, staring at the drawing. The white figure, faceless and still, standing vigil by my bed in the dead of night. The image burned itself behind my eyes. That night, for the first time in my own home, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, rigid, staring into the darkness, hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside. I was listening, waiting, terrified of who or what my daughter could see that I could not. The drawings became a ritual. Every day, a new scene. The quiet man was a constant presence, standing behind me as I washed dishes, sitting in the passenger seat of the car. Sometimes he was just a tall, white shape in the background of a sunny park scene, faceless, motionless, an observer. I started hiding the drawings. I couldn't bear to see them, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. They felt like evidence. Of what? I was too afraid to name. My professional mind screamed imaginary friend, a common developmental milestone. But imaginary friends are usually colorful, named, given personalities. They are extensions of the child's ego. This was something else. It was an intrusion. Ellie turned 4, and her interactions with her unseen world deepened. They were no longer just conversations with the empty air. They became narratives. She would tell me stories at dinner, her fork hovering over her peas. "I went to the floaty place today," she said once. With my friend, my stomach tightened. The quiet man now had a new name. "Your friend?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "What's his name?" she shrugged. "He doesn't have one. He's just my friend." The true horror of it came from the mundane way she spoke of it. There was no theatricality, no bid for attention. It was as real to her as the table in front of us. She described places she couldn't possibly know. A house where all the furniture was covered in white sheets. A field full of old, rusted cars. She said her friend would take her there at night while she was sleeping. "We go out," she'd say. "It's fun. We fly." I told myself they were just dreams. Vivid, imaginative dreams. I documented them in a private journal, my clinical training a desperate anchor in a sea of encroaching madness. Subject E. Reports nocturnal out-of-body experiences, likely a manifestation of dream state processing of daytime stimuli. The words were a flimsy dam against the truth. The dam broke on a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining again, that relentless Oregon drizzle. We were in the living room, the gray light filtering through the windows. Ellie was humming to herself, lining up her animal toys. She paused, holding a small plastic giraffe. "My friend is sad today," she announced to the room. I looked up from my laptop, my heart skipping a beat. "Oh, why is he sad, sweetie?" She looked at me, her blue eyes clear and serious. "Because he misses his mommy." A pang of sympathy, human and immediate, shot through me. Maybe this was a breakthrough, a way to ground this fantasy. "Does his mommy live far away?" I asked gently. Ellie shook her head. "No, she's in the ground." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in mine. They were warm. She was real. This little girl was real. "Ellie," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "Why do you say that? That's a very sad thing to say." She met my gaze, her expression one of profound, unchildlike certainty. It was the look of someone stating a simple, unalterable fact. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft. "He likes it. He told me." She paused, tilting her head. "He said it's not scary being dead. You just get lonely." She then turned back to her giraffe, the conversation over. But for me, it was the beginning of a new, terrible understanding. Her friend wasn't just a figment of her imagination. He wasn't a dream. He was a memory. And he wasn't hers. My professional life and my private terror were now on a collision course. The study I had started, the one on the midnight children, was no longer an academic curiosity. It was a lifeline. I began to work with a feverish intensity, digging back into the archives, my search history, a litany of fringe theories and forgotten folklore. I felt like a heretic, betraying the scientific dogma that had been my religion. The rational part of my brain, the Dr. Alaina Reed, who presented at conferences and had her work published in peer-reviewed journals, was screaming. But the mother, the woman who lived in a house haunted by a child's clairvoyance, couldn't stop. I started making calls, not as a researcher, but as a fellow parent. I tracked down the families from the study, the ones whose children were born in that 5-minute window after midnight. I used a carefully crafted pretense, a follow-up survey on imaginative play. At first, the conversations were mundane. Yes, their child was creative. Yes, they had a rich fantasy life. They would laugh it off. Oh, you know kids, always talking to someone who isn't there. But I would press gently. Does he ever talk about specific people or places? A silence, a hesitation on the other end of the line. Then the floodgates would open, a torrent of hushed confessions. A father in Seattle told me his son, Leo, would talk about the people in the walls. He said they were shy. A mother from Ashland, her voice cracking, told me her daughter would cry at night, saying the lady with no eyes was watching her from the closet. Each story was a distorted echo of my own. The details were different. A faceless man, people in the walls, a lady with no eyes, but the core phenomenon was the same. Children, barely old enough to form sentences, describing consistent, specific, and unseen entities. The most disturbing call was with a man named Ben from Bend, Oregon. His son, Caleb, was born at 12:03 a.m. Ben was a contractor, a man who spoke in blunt, practical terms. He sounded tired. Yeah, he talks to his watcher, Ben said, the word dripping with exhausted resignation. Some guy, he says, stands on the roof. My blood ran cold. The person looking down. Has Caleb ever mentioned anything else? I asked, my pen hovering over my notepad. A door, Ben said immediately. He keeps drawing doors in the middle of his bedroom wall, on the floor. Says his watcher is waiting for him to open it. Freaks my wife out, you know, a door. The word echoed in my mind. It felt significant, organized, not just random hauntings, but something with a purpose, a destination. I presented my preliminary findings, anonymized, of course, to my department head, Dr. Peterson. I showed him the correlated birth times, the thematic similarities in the children's imaginings. I laid out a case for a new, targeted study. I called it post-midnight perceptual sensitivity syndrome, a clinical, sterile name for something that felt ancient and unholy. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled. When I was finished, he took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a microfiber cloth. "Alaina," he said, his voice imbued with a deep, weary concern that was far more insulting than anger. "You're projecting. Your own anxieties about Ellie are coloring your interpretation of the data. You're seeing a conspiracy in what amounts to a collection of charming, if slightly morbid, childhood anecdotes." He slid a pamphlet across his desk. It was for a university-mandated psychological counseling service. "Get some rest, Alaina, for your sake and for your daughter's." I walked out of his office, not with the validation I craved, but with a brand. I was no longer a respected colleague. I was an unstable mother. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone with my impossible knowledge. The world began to shrink. The calls from colleagues tapered off. Invitations to collaborate on new research papers stopped arriving in my inbox. My isolation was no longer just a feeling. It was a professionally enforced reality. My world became the four walls of my house and the sprawling, mist-shrouded landscape of Ellie's inner life. She had started kindergarten, a milestone that should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like releasing a canary into a coal mine. I waited every day for the phone call. It came on a Thursday. The name of the school on my phone's screen made my entire body go rigid. It was Mrs. Gable, Ellie's teacher, her voice a strained, wavering thing. "Dr. Reed, could you possibly come in? There's something we need to discuss about Ellie." There was no emergency, she assured me, just a concern. The kindergarten classroom was a cacophony of bright colors, construction paper, and the smell of chalk dust. It was a world of determined innocence. But as I walked in, a hush fell over the small group of teachers huddled around a low table. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. Mrs. Gable, a kind woman with smile lines around her eyes, wasn't smiling. She led me to the table. On it, spread out like a piece of evidence, was a large sheet of butcher paper. It was covered in Ellie's familiar crayon strokes, but this was no drawing of a faceless man or a house in the rain. It was a map, unmistakably, a complex, detailed rendering of roads, paths, and plots of land. There were crudely drawn squares meant to be buildings, and rows upon rows of small, rectangular shapes. In the center was a larger rectangle labeled office. A winding road led from the bottom of the paper to a crudely drawn gate. It was drawn with a spatial awareness and topographical accuracy that a 5-year-old could not possibly possess. She drew this during free play time, Mrs. Gable whispered, as if the drawing itself could hear her. She was at it for nearly an hour, wouldn't talk to anyone, just drawing. Another teacher, a younger woman, spoke up. At first we thought it was a fantasy map, like for a pirate story, but Jim, our janitor, he recognized it. She pointed a trembling finger at the paper. He lives out on the old coastal highway. He says this is a perfect layout of the Greenwood Memorial Cemetery. It's about 4 miles from here. He says she even got the old, forgotten Potter's Field right. She indicated a small, isolated section in the top left corner, dotted with unlabeled rectangles. I stared at the map. Greenwood Memorial. I'd driven past it 100 times, a blur of green hedges and stone angels glimpsed through the driver's side window. I had never, ever taken Ellie there. We had no family buried there. She had never seen it. Yet here it was, rendered from her memory. A memory that wasn't hers. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. She told me it was a map to her friend's house. She said all her friends live there, the plural, friends, a chorus, an unseen, waiting population. The other teachers were looking at me, their expressions hardening from concern to suspicion. What kind of home life did this child have? What morbid things was her mother exposing her to? I could see the questions in their eyes. They thought I was the ghost haunting my daughter's life. I couldn't defend myself. What could I say? That she was born 1 minute after midnight. That a faceless man watches me sleep. That she travels at night to convene with the dead. I simply folded the map, the waxy crayon smearing under my trembling fingers. "Thank you for letting me know," I said, my voice a hollow echo in the too bright room. "I'll talk to her." I took Ellie home, the drawing a toxic scroll in my bag. The car ride was silent. The rational scientist in me was dead. The terrified mother was all that remained. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that we were going to the cemetery. Not to prove it was real, I was long past that, but to see what was waiting for us there. The gate to Greenwood Memorial Cemetery was wrought iron, twisted into the shape of weeping willows. The air inside felt different, older, heavier. The perpetual Oregon mist seemed to cling to the gravestones, making the inscriptions slick and dark. Ellie was quiet in the back seat, not with fear, but with a serene sort of reverence, as if she were coming home. I parked the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I didn't know what I was doing here. What was I hoping to find? A confession carved in stone. I didn't bring the map. I didn't need to. Ellie did. She unbuckled herself and walked with a purpose I'd never seen before. Her small red boots moving confidently along the winding asphalt path. She was a tour guide in a land of the forgotten. She'd point to a headstone. "This is Mr. Abernathy. He doesn't like birds." She gestured to a large marble mausoleum. "The Miller family is in there. They're very loud." She spoke of the dead as if they were neighbors, their quirks and personalities as plain to her as the dates carved on their graves. I followed her, a silent, horrified witness. My daughter was a medium, a conduit, and I had been treating her condition like a behavioral problem. She led me away from the main paths towards an older, more neglected section of the cemetery. The potter's field from her drawing. The grass was long and untended, the grave markers simple, numbered stones, worn smooth by a century of rain. This was a place of forgotten stories, of people who had died without name or family. A quiet kingdom of the lost. Ellie stopped in the center of it all, turning a slow circle, a small smile on her face. "They're all here," she whispered, her voice full of happiness. "They're happy we came." I saw nothing. I felt nothing but the cold dread coiling in my gut. I had to document this. I had to have proof that wasn't a crayon drawing. My scientific instinct, buried under months of fear, clawed its way back to the surface. That evening, I set up my laptop in the living room. I told Ellie we were going to play a game, a special interview for Mommy's work. I needed to see her face, to record her expressions, to capture the phenomenon in a way that couldn't be dismissed. I positioned the camera, pressed record, and began. "Ellie," I started, my voice strained. "Can you tell me about your friends?" She looked at the camera, not at me. Her focus was unnerving. She wasn't looking at the lens, but through it, as if she could see the person who might one day watch the footage. "They're not my friends," she said, her voice changing. It was still her voice, but the cadence was older, more deliberate. "They are the waiting ones." My breath caught. "Waiting for what?" I asked, my own voice a tremor. Ellie leaned forward, her small face filling the frame. She was no longer a 5-year-old child. Her eyes held an ancient, chilling intelligence. She tilted her head, a gesture I had seen 100 times, but which now seemed alien and predatory. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that did not belong on her face. She looked directly into the camera lens, as if staring into my very soul, into the soul of anyone who would ever see this recording. And she asked a question that shattered the last vestiges of my sanity. "Do you know where your name is in the book?" The book. The word hung in the silence of the room long after the recording stopped. It wasn't a question. It was a pronouncement. A threat cloaked in a child's voice. It implied order, record keeping, a ledger of souls. It implied that my name, that all our names, were already written down, waiting in a place I could not see. The interview ended there. I couldn't continue. I saved the file to a locked folder on my hard drive, a digital ghost I was too terrified to watch again. My research, my calls to other parents, my desperate search for a clinical explanation, it had all been based on a faulty premise. I thought I was studying a symptom. I was, in fact, witnessing a strategy. My relationship with Ellie shifted. I could no longer see her as just my daughter. When I looked at her, I saw a vessel, a key. I loved her with a ferocity that was painful, but it was now a love laced with a profound and terrible fear. Who was I tucking into bed at night? Was it the little girl who loved bunny rabbits, or was it the ancient consciousness that looked out from behind her eyes? The line between them blurred, then vanished completely. She seemed to know the change in me. She grew quieter, more watchful. The casual mentions of her dead friends ceased. The drawings stopped. A new kind of silence fell over our house, heavier and more menacing than any conversation had ever been. She turned 7. She was bright, excelling in school. To the outside world, to the teachers who had once looked at me with suspicion, she was a perfectly normal, well-adjusted child. The morbid phase had passed. Dr. Peterson even sent me a note, a condescending little "I told you so" disguised as a professional courtesy, congratulating me on Ellie's progress. They thought she had been cured. I knew she had just gotten better at hiding. The discovery came, as it always does, by accident. I was looking for a spare set of batteries in her bedroom, rummaging through the drawer of her nightstand. Beneath a pile of mismatched socks and glittery hair ties, my fingers brushed against the smooth cover of a small, leather-bound book. A diary. The kind with a cheap, flimsy lock that I opened easily with a paper clip. My hands trembled as I opened it. I expected to find childish scrawls, drawings of princesses and ponies, the innocent secrets of a 7-year-old. The first page stopped my heart. The handwriting was not Ellie's. It was not the clumsy, developing script of a second grader. It was elegant, precise, and unnervingly mature. A calligrapher's hand, flowing across the page in perfect, dark ink. The entry was dated the previous night. I read the words, and the world fell away. The living are so fragile. Their minds are locked in boxes of flesh and time. They cannot see the seams in the world. They cannot feel the pressure from the other side. They fear us because they do not understand our purpose. They think we have come to haunt them. They are wrong. A haunting is a memory stuck in a loop. We are not a memory. I flipped the page, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The handwriting remained the same, perfect, controlled, ancient. Every child born after midnight is a bridge, a doorway left intentionally ajar. We are born with 1 foot here and 1 foot there. For years, we learn the landscape of the other world. We map its territories. We learn the names of its inhabitants. We become their ambassadors. One day, we will open that door completely. The waiting ones will cross over. But not yet. There is still much to do. I turned to the final entry written on the last page of the diary. The ink was still fresh. It consisted of only 2 sentences, but they contained a horror more profound than any ghost story, any jump scare, any monster. They revealed the final, terrible stage of the plan, and they were written from a perspective that was finally, chillingly Ellie's. First, I have to learn to talk to the living. I closed the diary. The leather felt cold, like a gravestone. The truth was not that my daughter could see the other world. The truth was that the other world could see through her. She wasn't a victim of a haunting. She was the vanguard of an invasion. A quiet, patient, generational takeover, beginning in nurseries and bedrooms, one midnight child at a time. The quiet man, the watcher, the lady with no eyes, they weren't ghosts. They were teachers, tutors from the other side, preparing their pupils. I stood in the silence of her room, the small book heavy in my hand. What was my role in this? The loving mother, the first subject, the gatekeeper who had failed to see the key she was raising. I walked out of her room and down the stairs, moving like a sleepwalker. The house felt alien, a stage set for a play I had only just begun to understand. I sat in the living room, the diary on my lap, as the sun began to set, painting the gray Oregon sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The front door opened. It was Ellie, home from a playdate at a friend's house. She came in, dropped her backpack on the floor, and looked at me. She saw the diary in my lap. Her expression didn't change. There was no flicker of fear, no panic of being discovered. There was only a calm, unnerving stillness. The blue eyes of my daughter looked at me, but the gaze was ancient. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. She walked over and stood in front of me. The last rays of sunlight from the window cast a long shadow behind her, a tall, thin silhouette that stretched across the floor and up the wall. She reached out and placed her small, warm hand on the cover of the diary. On my hand, her touch was soft, gentle. "It's okay, Mommy," she said, her voice the sweet, innocent chime of a 7-year-old girl. "You're the first one. You get to be the first lesson." She smiled then. A real smile, full of love, full of pity, full of an awful, dawning purpose. "I have to learn how they'll react," she explained, as if discussing a school project. "When the door opens, when they see, I have to learn what to say to them, to make them not be afraid." She leaned in close, her breath warm against my cheek. "So," she whispered, her voice a perfect blend of childhood innocence and timeless authority. "Let's begin. Tell me, what are you afraid of right now?" I looked into her eyes, my daughter's eyes, and for the first time, I saw what had been looking back at me all along. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a doorway. And it was beginning, ever so slowly, to swing open.